But anyway.
Anyway.
Yes.
Main topic time.
Yes, our era in Doctor Who magazine comics, Dave. There's so much to say here.
There is so much to say. So I might just kick us off with a couple of opening thoughts about what we're doing and why.
Yeah, please.
And one thing that I've found is that there are people in Doctor Who fandom who are considerably more invested in the Doctor Who comics than I think either of us, and that's fantastic. It's something that they look and research, and the Stripped for Action docos on the DVD range were really interesting for people like us to sort of dive into. And I'm not remotely one of those sort of people. Like I know some of the names of artists, and I know a bit about the different eras of comics, but I've really only read my era, and I don't really read comics outside of Doctor Who. In fact, I don't read comics outside of Doctor Who, full stop. So that's the reason why I wanted to talk about our era, but also a lot of people who do talk about Doctor Who comics talk about this sort of big golden age, and they talk about the Toms, the Davos, and those early Collins, and there's all this wonderful sort of stuff. And then they're like, and then there was some other stuff that wasn't very good, and we don't want to talk about that. Or they grow out of them, or they moved on. And so a lot of stuff that was really when we were reading DWM, yourself a couple of years earlier than me, I think, that era doesn't really get talked about as much. There are some great podcasts out there talking about the entirety of Doctor Who magazine comics. I'll give a shout out to our friends at Diddly Dum, who on issues 136 and 137 in the middle of last year had Mark Cockram on, another friend of the podcast, and they did a really good two-parter on the history of Doctor Who comics. But again, didn't really cover what we're going to cover. So this is just a way of us saying, we're not comic book experts, we're not Doctor Who comic experts, but we love the little bit of the thing that we grew up with, and we just want to talk about that and why we love it and what it was. Maybe you'll be sharing that nostalgia with us. Maybe it will inspire you to go and look at a few of these yourself, or maybe it'll just be background listening. But that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and I hope it does all those things, frankly. I tweeted yesterday or the day before, I can't recall. This may sound like a dry topic or even an odd topic, but I think there's some interesting stuff in here, and I think if people are listening, they might sort of tease out, oh, that sounds like an interesting story, I'll look that up. Or that sounds like an interesting artist, I'll look up his work, and all that sort of stuff. And I think it's a different sort of episode for us, Dave, and probably even in the way we sort of, we'll have me talking for a block here, and then you'll be talking for a block, because my era is different to your era.
Yeah.
But I think there's some good stuff in here, yeah. So why don't we rip in?
The show is all yours, Rob, because your era comes first.
Excellent. I think of my era in the Doctor Who magazine strip as Colin comics, if you want to put that in quotation marks, drawn by the absolutely legendary John Ridgway. Full stop.
Now that is a name that I have heard.
Yeah. He did basically all of the Colin comics from start to finish, and they started in April of 84. This is long before I got into buying Doctor Who magazine, as we'll talk about in a moment. And he actually continued on and did the first Sylvester strip. So John Ridgway actually encompasses this incredible space of time. And when you see John Ridgway talk about his work, because I always thought his art just looks sensational, he talks about himself as really wanting or seeing himself as an illustrator more so than a comic artist. And I can see that in his work. The attention to detail is extreme, and it's just so beautiful to look at. I love his stuff. What I wanted to say, though, I think of this era as being Colin comics drawn by John Ridgway and all that stuff. But what's interesting is if I take the first Doctor Who magazine I bought, which is issue 119, it's only 15 more issues beyond that, a bit over a year, basically, of Ridgway. And 4 of those 15 are him doing a Sylvester story. So what I think of as my era, Colin drawn by John Ridgway, is actually this tiny little block.
Yeah, it's something I'm going to come to as well, that when you're buying DWM once every 4 weeks as a younger person, what felt like an era, actually look back and go, that was 12 issues, that was nothing.
Yeah, exactly right. So I guess what's happened now that I take this chance to look back is that I've had a year, give or take, of seeing Ridgway drawing Colin, and it imprinted on me so hard that is the style of Doctor Who magazine comic for me. And of course, with some of the earlier stories in his run being so legendary, you hear people, talk about Voyager. They name check that a lot because A, because it's good, and B, because it had a lot of standalone reprints, and C, because it's 3 stories that take up, 9 issues or something like that. So it's had much wider exposure, and that just reinforces my point of view about Ridgway and Colin and all of that sort of stuff. And indeed, during the past week, a friend of the show, Rob from 42 to Doomsday, tweeted in response to me posting some artwork from Voyager. He said, and I actually noted the quote down, "I'm either showing my age or my stubborn streak, but this era has never been bettered." And I'm like, yeah, right on, Rob.
There's a lot of people that would say that.
Exactly. So, look, I'm going to talk about some specific stories in a moment, but from my perspective, it's a fabulous era, and we'll talk about it. Yes, there's some real irony, of course, and I'm not immune to missing that. Colin hadn't gone down well on TV. Twin Dilemma was a train wreck. His first season is patchy. There are some good stories, but there's also some real dross too.
And you can debate how well it went down with the general public. There was a segment of fandom it went down very badly with. Yeah,
massively so. But here in the comics, he was an interesting, likeable Doctor. Basically from the start. It's almost Big Finish-like. Decades before Big Finish was a thing, it's people digging the Colin Baker Doctor who didn't rate him on television at all.
Yeah.
I'd look at his TV episodes and think, ooh, that's a bit cringe. I don't like that. Hate the costume, blah, blah, blah. But in black and white comic strips where his personality came across a lot differently, I thought he was just fantastic.
Yeah, look, you're right. It was a very different era to the TV. Like, from the little I've seen of it, it's very different to the TV show.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll get into the stories. I won't go through every story, dear listener, just the big ones. And I noted that Colin started in April of '84 in Dwim and had some cool adventures like the Shapeshifter, which is where they get Frobisher in. And Frobisher isn't even a penguin at first when he comes into the story. And then Voyager, which, as I mentioned, is about 9 months worth of stories over 3 different stories. There's a very cool 3-part Cyberman thing that I love too. But we need to fast forward to December of '86 to get to that issue of Doctor Who magazine 119 that I bought first.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, it's the second part of a story called Changes. And I began with this second part, but it's such a simple story, it wasn't impenetrable by any stretch. And what fascinated me was the art. I've mentioned Ridgway's style, but also what he was drawing fascinated me with Changes, because the Doctor and Frobisher are walking around the TARDIS looking for Perry, and there's also an intruder on the ship. It's a very basic story. And they walk through rooms that look like asteroid fields. And they walk through the TARDIS zoo, which isn't really a zoo. The Doctor hasn't locked up animals, but he describes it as, when he's going around the universe, he saves animals and wants to take them to other locations. And they're in all these smallish boxes, but we're shown very, very cleverly they have TARDIS-like interiors, like infinite savannah for these wildcats to run around or whatever, inside these tiny little boxes. So these animals are being looked after very well in this TARDIS zoo, and that fired my imagination. And they walk past a room, and you can see Bessie is parked in the room. And they walk down this long, dark tunnel, almost like at a railway station or something. And you can see old costumes sitting on Taylor's dummies. You can see Davo's costume. You can see Tom's, I think it's his season 18 costume or something like that. And I can't tell you how this made me feel. I was new to fandom, and I became so excited by this, and my imagination was firing, and they even end up in the wooden secondary control room of of the TARDIS. It's like fan overload stuff. It's probably even fan wank, and the story is barely there, but the visuals, both the Ridgway style of drawing and what he was drawing, just pulled me in. I couldn't have started on a better, strip here. I thought, this is wonderful.
It sounds lovely.
Yeah. Moving on into pretty much the middle of '87, there's a story called The Gift, which is very good. The Sixth Doctor, Perry and Frobisher are having some downtime. So yes, Perry has joined the script now, and because they're having this downtime, it's a good excuse to draw Nicola in a bikini. I guess any excuse. And they do something the TV series should do, I think, or could do. And that's Colin has all these invites to parties across time and space. And, you know, they're like, we're bored, what shall we do? And he just pulls, like, he's fanning out a deck of cards. He's like, well, what party do you want to go to? And I thought, that's really cool, because you could actually do that, you know.
Yeah.
You know, so great. And they go to this weird planet, and it's like something from the gangster days in the US, like the 20s or the 30s or something like that. And before they go to the party itself, they run into the guy who's having the party. His brother's a mad scientist, and he gives them a package to deliver. They deliver it to the guy at his party. That's why this strip is called The Gift. And it's this weird little self-replicating robot that jumps out of the box and runs away and starts ripping up the city and taking raw materials and building more little replicating robots. And suddenly the whole city gets pulled apart by these self-replicating robots. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. And it also does some really nice timey-wimey stuff where Colin... I shouldn't call him Colin, I should call him the Sixth Doctor, shouldn't I? The Sixth Doctor has to go and sort of unravel how these robots came to be and stuff. So he goes back in time, and he's in like a NASA spacesuit, and he's on a moon, and he learns how this robot was from a crashed, you know, saucer or something, and then this mad scientist got a hold of it, etc., etc. And I always thought that was a really cool, imaginative kind of thing, really doing something that the show wasn't doing, but which I thought was just a really fabulous, exciting story.
Yeah.
Moving on to one that a lot of people will know, and here we're towards the end of 87. This is actually the end of Colin's run, or the Sixth Doctor's run. It's the World Shapers. Does that ring any bells?
It does ring a lot of bells. I think it's one that a lot of people talk about.
Yeah. This strip, spoilers, features the death of Jamie McCrimmon.
Oh, wow.
Which, yeah, to this day has never been contradicted in anything, you know, not in novels or audio or anything. So do we take this to be canon? I guess we do. And look... if it's already starting to sound fan-wanky that they've brought Jamie back again with the Sixth Doctor and they kill him, hold on to your hats, because this is also a Mondasian Cyberman origin story, essentially, which shows that the Cybermen evolved from the Vord.
Yes.
And these origins, of course, conflict with all the other origin stories we've been given for the Cybermen. I get all of that. However, this is really important if you were watching during the Capaldi era.
Yep.
Because the World Shapers was specifically referenced in The Doctor Falls as one of the origins of the Cybermen, when the Doctor mentions Planet 14. Though the TV episode also established Planet 14, Marinus and Mondas as separate planets, contradicting the World Shapers, because here in the World Shapers we're shown Marinus, which these guys who shape worlds refer to as Planet 14, because it's the 14th planet they're about to world shape. And then through their world shaping technique, which speeds up time, it evolves into Mondas. So for anyone still following me with what I'm saying, it's very weird, bit fan-wanky, but you know what? It's a really cool story too. There's even this, when they first get to Marinus, there's a dying Time Lord there, and he's out of regenerations. And when he dies, he just melts away. His body melts away, and apparently that's what happens when a Time Lord runs out of regenerations. And again, as a fan, a new fan even, I'm seeing this stuff, think, oh my god, that's what happens when a Time Lord runs out of lives. Oh, Jesus, this is great. And they go into his TARDIS, and it's an amazing modern TARDIS, and it's just so cool to look at. So, yeah, look, there's fan wank by the truckload, and this Vord turning into Cybermen. That's just nuts. Going back in time and getting an old Jamie McCrimmon and then killing him off in the final episode. I get the wank, but I love it.
I was thinking all the way through your description of that if you told me that was the proposed plot for an upcoming episode of Doctor Who, I would think that was absolutely terrible. But as a comic strip, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And then we're getting towards the end of my era in Doctor Who comics, only another year's worth here. The wheels really start to fall off for me with Sylve's era, because it starts with some really clunky and confusing stories. I mean, John Ridgway leaves the art almost straight away. He does the first story called A Cold Day in Hell. Not that his Sylvester, mind you, was brilliant by any means. In the very early strips, you can almost detect every publicity shot Sylve had ever done was the template for the Doctor and all of the panels. You're like, oh yeah, I've seen that angle of Sylvester McCoy before in a publicity shot. Oh, I've seen him do that expression in a publicity shot, etc., etc. So he debuts in an Ice Warrior story that's a bit of a non-event. It's cool to see the Ice Warriors, but the story is a bit basic. Then he does a one-shot called Redemption, where they take a character from that first story, and she turns out to be a baddie, and they get pursued in the TARDIS. The guy who's been pursuing her comes and takes her away, and the Doctor's like, yeah, okay, cool, she was a baddie, so you can take her, that's fine. Very weird sort of one-shot. Then we get to a story, and I'm going to talk about this one in some detail, called The Crossroads of Time. And this confused me for the longest time, because you have Sylv in the TARDIS, and again I should be saying the Seventh Doctor, and the TARDIS collides with a bloke called Death's Head out in the vortex, and so Death's Head and the TARDIS both crash land to this planet. Death's Head is in his own ship, and also landing on the planet is a strange looking guy called a Time Warden, who's there to sort of adjudicate the collision, like he's sort of a traffic cop for the vortex. And 13-year-old me wasn't having this at all. Like, what? A higher power than the Time Lords, like these Time Wardens out in the vortex, directing traffic. Like, bollocks. This is ridiculous. Anyway, Death's Head's quite a nasty guy, and the Time Warden takes off because Death's Head is so scary, and leaves the Doctor to sort of run around with Death's Head running after him, and, mad chase ensues. Then the Doctor pulls out the Master's tissue compression eliminator.
Sure.
And because Death's Head, I didn't mention, he's about 30 or 40 feet tall. That's why he's scary. And the Doctor zaps him. And it doesn't kill him like the TCE kills everybody else. It just shrinks him down to normal size.
Right.
And now that he's normal size and sort of manageable, he can come into the TARDIS. And then the Doctor tricks him and opens up a time vortex or something in the TARDIS and sucks him away to a different dimension or whatever it is. And I thought, this story is just bloody silly. But do you know what was happening in the background? And I only learned this years later, Dave.
I have a vague idea, but you'll know better.
Basically, Marvel UK had invented Death's Head to be a character in the Transformers, in the UK comic strip of Transformers. That's why he was 30, 40 feet tall. Then they thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if Death's Head had his own comic book, which he did actually get. But in his comic book, it's going to be ridiculous if he's 30 or 40 feet tall dealing with everyone else who's tiny. Let's transition him through Doctor Who magazine so the Doctor can zap him with the TCE, make him normal size, then he gets zapped off into a different, I think it's like the 81st century or whatever it is. And then we can tell the stories in his own comic series and he'll be a normal size. How bloody convoluted is that?
So I didn't know all of that. I was aware that there was basically Marvel saying, hey, Doctor Who magazine, you're one of our titles. You're not out there on your own. We're doing a crossover with you. Hey, watch our crossover, and sort of smashing these things together. I didn't know that it was specifically for the purpose of shrinking Death's Head to get him into his own comic. That's new to me.
Yeah, no, that's what it was all about, and I think there's about 12 issues of the Death's Head comic out there. But this was a weird time for Doctor Who in comics, Dave. There was a comic called, I think it was called Incredible Hulk Presents, which was an Incredible Hulk comic, but in the comic there would be other strips. And believe it or not, in every edition of Incredible Hulk Presents, there was a Doctor Who strip, but aimed at younger readers. So not only in this era were they doing like John Ridgway and a guest writer doing the Doctor Who strip, elsewhere Marvel was doing a totally separate strip for the Incredible Hulk comic. And I'm thinking, how much was this all costing? Because the Doctor Who comic was costing half of Dwim's budget. Yeah. But Marvel was also doing this other comic, and I think they wanted to see some economies of scale and were nudging the editor like, why don't you just take on these comics, then you don't have to lose half your budget on your comic. And thankfully he said no, because I think these were very, very childlike, kid-friendly type comics.
Junior Doctor Who stuff.
Very junior Doctor Who, and apparently one or two made it in.
I have seen a couple of examples of this. I can't remember where, but yeah, they are very... It's not Doctor Who. It's the Seventh Doctor, but it's not Doctor Who.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, we're going to move into my final three stories here. I'm going to give a mention to all of these. First of all, Claws of the Clarthy comes not long after. This runs from April to June of 1988. And after I thought a bunch of Sylv strips were really bad, I actually had a bit of time for this one because it's Sylv in mid-19th century London. and some aliens have crashed their spaceship and are afoot, and one's ended up in a sort of a circus freak show, and his robot, meanwhile, is getting around causing havoc, after dark. And the other two aliens that crashed in the ship with him are the real baddies of the piece. And I won't go into any more detail, but there's some really cool stuff like the Great Exhibition. I think anything set in the sort of mid-19th century has the Great Exhibition in it. There's lots of atmospheric London scenery in there. It's a decent little story. And with a few changes, it probably could have even done okay on TV. It's that solid. So, after a few dud Sylve stories, there's a tick for claws of the Clarthy.
Okay.
Then, second last one, Culture Shock. This is a one-off in issue 139 of Dwim. It's July of 88. I really lost the plot with this one as a kid. Basically, it's told from the point of view of a cell culture. So if you think back to your science days at school and cell cultures and things, think of a cell culture and think of it being a mass mind, and then think of it taking on the body of this weird little dinosaur that's sort of dog-sized. Sounds weird already, right?
Right.
Sylve lands in the TARDIS and he's all mopey about something and he's thinking of just giving up and going home, and then he comes across this little dog-sized dinosaur thing and it's on its last legs, and Sylve works out what it needs. The thing keels over and apparently dies, and he takes its corpse and puts it in a body of water, and all the cells inside it, this cell culture, this mass mind, go out into the water and continue to live in the body of water. It's really weird and trippy, and some people probably find great meaning or beauty in this, but at 13 years of age, it was over my head. And even now that I've reread it recently, it's style over substance. It's just bizarre. And at this juncture, I was really starting to lose interest in the strip. There'd only been, as I say, one good story in the past year. But I will mention a story that comes after it for one particular reason. It's called Planet of the Dead. It's from September to October of 88. And that was cool because it had shapeshifters in it. And I spoke earlier of being, I'm a fan. I'm loving all this fan wank stuff. And, you go walking through the TARDIS and show me old costumes and bring back Jamie and turn Vought into Cybermen. This is all fantastic. And in Planet of the Dead, these shapeshifters at different times shapeshift into old companions, and they shapeshift into other doctors. So you get to see Tom and Peter and all the other doctors. And the real fan wank inside me really was taken by that. But at this point in time, around issue 142 of Doctor Who magazine, I was really giving up on the strip after what had been such a great start with the John Ridgway Collins stuff, which I then went back and read all the early stuff, of course. But that was at a later time. My actual first flush of comic strip fandom was done.
Nice.
There you go.
Nice. Okay. Look, I'll launch into mine, and then I think we'll do sort of a few comments to finish, sort of comparing notes.
Yeah.
So look, the era that I'm going to talk about comes a couple of years later. It starts really in 92. Now, a lot of people who are big fans of Doctor Who comics more generally will tell you there's two big things wrong with this era, and I think they're two of the strengths of this era.
Oh.
Now, one thing they say is that a lot of the good eras of Doctor Who comics, like, for example, those early to middle Collins, have got one static writer, one static artist, and they build a sort of a whole continuing world that's really, really good. That doesn't happen in these era of the later McCoy comics, the later Seventh Doctor comics. But on the other hand, you get writers like Andrew Cartmell, Mark Platt, Paul Cornell, a little way down the track, Gareth Roberts, Kate Orman. So you're getting very recognisable writers who actually were involved in the production or would go on to be involved in later production. So I think there's a strength in that variety and the names that they were able to get in at this point. And the other thing that some people will say is that Doctor Who comic had always been a very standalone thing in its own world with its own continuity.
Yes.
Going right back, the first Doctor travelled with John and Gillian, and the second Doctor had a whole adventure with scarecrows where he was regenerated, and the third Doctor had this whole little continuity with his little house down at the beach, and his car was called a different name. I think it was Betsy instead of Bessie or something.
Oh, and I've got a good one too. Sylvester, because of the crossover with Colin, in his first story, he talks to Frobisher about just getting rid of Perry and Perry leaving. And so it's like Mel never happened.
Yeah, so they just have their own continuity, whereas we're now getting into, as I say, from 92, the wilderness years are very much on top of us now. We've sort of gone through 90 and it's like, oh, there's another season of Doctor Who coming shortly, and 91, yeah, maybe it's coming, maybe not. And by 92, it's like, okay, season 27 is not coming.
No.
Doctor Who is not on our TV screens. And there's lots of rumours, and there's lots of stories, but it's not on our TV screen. So Doctor Who fandom is able to kind of become what it wants to become, almost unconstrained by the TV series, and the new adventures are happening, the missing adventures start to happen, and they and the Doctor Who comics say, well, let's actually get together and create this universe where we're all sort of working off each other so that fans have got this thing that they can live in. And as a 12, 13, 14-year-old across the course of this era, that to me was wonderful. I felt like I was part of a proper era of Doctor Who, and you'd read the magazine and there'll be some reference to something, and then you read the next new adventure and it'll be calling back to that and setting each other up, and I just thought it was so wonderful to be a part of.
Yeah.
Even if it was, to some people, a betrayal of the nature of the comic. So that's sort of framing the era that I'm going to talk about. Now, the first issue of DWM that I bought properly, 184, actually didn't have a new comic in it. There'd been some controversies around a comic called Evening's Empire that sort of disappeared after, I think, one episode. And they reprinted a couple of old comics from the 70s. The first one was called Business as Usual. And this was an outstandingly good comic. It's basically about a guy who's hired by a plastics factory to discover why this new plastics factory down the road is suddenly doing so amazingly, awesomely out of nowhere. And, of course, finds out that it's being run by the Nestines, and they're making Autons, and they're making little, like, 80s-style plastic toy soldiers that are actually Autons. And
nice.
It's really, really cool. And that kind of got me into the idea of, hey, you can have these really awesome adventures in the comics. There was another one, The Fires Down Below, which was Unit versus the Dominators, a very simple plot by John Peel. Then we get into the first Seventh Doctor comics that I saw. The Grief was a 3-parter, where the Doctor and Ace fight the Lom. It's not the best comic, but it was a nice little adventure and definitely played on that whole vibe coming out of season 26 of the Seventh Doctor as a manipulator, willing to sacrifice people. Ace doesn't quite trust him or share his values, and that's all there. We then go into a very weird comic in Doctor Who magazine 188 from July of 92, a 3-parter called Ravens, written by former script editor Andrew Cartmel, in which a bunch of hooligans or bikies or something are threatening a defenseless woman and her young daughter.
Oh, I've heard of this
You've
one.
heard of this one?
Yeah.
And so the Doctor goes back in time, finds this like ancient samurai warrior called the Raven, whose own wife and daughter was killed by his enemies, kind of picks him up in the TARDIS, drops him off at this fight, and has him brutally slaughter the bikies to save the young woman. And it's just the most weird, bizarre thing. And Cartmel's sort of love of the graphic novel and the sort of comics he read is very there, because it's all very not dialogue intense. It's all very sort of brooding little narrators comments, and then, you know, great big panels of sort of black ink blood spewing everywhere. And I was 12 when I read this. I was like, what the hell is this?
It's like Quentin Tarantino has come to Doctor Who.
Yeah, I loathed it as a boy. I look at it now and I go, okay, I see what Cartmel is doing. And Cartmel has said he's quite proud that, like, I did this, you know, cartoon that everybody's like, oh, wow, that's very edgy, that's very different. And, you know, you can see Cartmel enjoying that. But these first few issues sort of showed me the differences that Doctor Who could do. But the era really starts for me with a one-off cartoon by the name of Cat Litter in October of 92. This is written by Mark Platt, and it is illustrated by John Ridgway, who has come back to do a one-off here.
Nice.
And what we have in this is Ace is pottering around in the TARDIS, and suddenly it starts to rearrange itself around her. And it's all plotted out sort of like a board game or a chess game, and you move through the different panels, almost Snakes and Ladders-ish about it, as the TARDIS retransfigures itself around Ace and eventually sort of erases her room. And eventually she gets up to the console room and the Doctor's there, and she says, what's going on? And the Doctor's oh, well, maybe the TARDIS is foreshadowing something. That's very strange, ... Now, this came out in October of 92. The same month, a couple of weeks later, the new adventure Love and War came out, which, of course, is the one where Ace does depart the TARDIS. So, as a fan, you'd watch this really well-drawn and well-written comic that foreshadows this idea that maybe Ace is going to leave, and then the new adventures actually have the departure. Wow. So, as a boy, you think, wow, this is all part of one coherent universe. Yeah. Now, if you're a fan of the comic, you sort of feel as though the comic's like given away the Ace exit to somebody else. And I can see how that would feel like a betrayal. But to me, it was all part of this wonderful universe, which then picked up because, of course, in Love and War, Bernice Summerfield, Benny, becomes the companion. And suddenly in the next issue of DWM, Benny is there just accompanying the Doctor. And she's drawn as per the cover of Love and War. And all her characteristics are very much like from the novels. So Benny is sort of an amateur psychologist and likes to sort of look at body language and stuff, and she picks out that there's a spy and what his motivations are based on that body language. Like, she notices that this guy stops blinking at one point, for example. Now, the story is called Pure Blood. Yes. It's 4 parts, and it features the Sontarans. And the premise is that the Sontaran homeworld is attacked and destroyed and bombed. And the Sontarans are like, how did this happen? No one can get through our genetic barrier. No one could do this. And well, we can't worry about that now. Let's get the race banks and get out of here. And they go to an Earth genetic research station where they want to use their technology to start the Sontaran race again. And there's a Rutan spy there who is there to stop them. And the whole conceit of it is that the Rutans found this colony of pre-clone era Sontarans and said, hey, your cousins over there have betrayed everything you stood for, and they're now genetic mutations and they're monsters. Hey, go bomb their planet because you're genetically the same and you can get through their screens, and all of that sort of goes on. So it's these really clever ideas, but in there as well, you've got these wonderful drawings of Sontarans. It's by Colin Andrew, the artwork. But even stuff like, as the Rutan's being interrogated in this sort of field to stop its electrical field, it starts to sort of warp out of its human shape, and just stuff you could never show on TV. So that really got me into things. But boy, what comes next? Issue 197, December 92, Emperor of the Daleks.
Yeah. Now that's had a reprint, I think.
It's had a few reprints, I think.
Right.
I've got a lovely pristine edition of the reprint, written by Paul Cornell, drawn by Lee Sullivan, who had done a bit of work over the course of the DWM comic strip. It's a 6-part epic. Part 1. Now, part 1. You're a 12-year-old boy. You open up DWM, and suddenly there's Colin Baker, there's the 6th Doctor, and Nicola on the planet Skaro in the aftermath of Revelation of the Daleks. Davros has been picked up from Necros, taken back to Skaro. The Emperor Dalek there is putting him on trial. You've betrayed the Daleks. You're going to be executed. And the 6th Doctor rescues Davros and takes him off somewhere in the TARDIS. And you're like, what's going on? And then in the next issue, we're back to the McCoy Doctor with Bernice, and it goes on from there. And this whole 6-part epic basically fills in all the continuity gaps between Davros leaving at the end of Revelation of the Daleks and Davros becoming the Emperor of the Daleks by the time of Remembrance. And it does this via a trip to the planet Spyridon, where we find out that the Doctor dropped Davros off to basically rescue the 10,000 Daleks that were left there at Planet of the Daleks, and the Doctor's again basically setting up the whole Dalek Civil War that you see in Remembrance. So it's really cool. It's really fan-wanky. Like, it is epically fan-wanky.
Yeah.
It's got the 6th and 7th Doctors. It's got Nicola. It's got Perry. It's got Bernice. Absalom Dark from Nemesis of the Daleks comes back. It's just this really wonderful epic. And of course, because issue 200 occurred during part 4 of this, they did the whole thing for that issue in colour. So there was this one colour issue of the comic for part 4 of Emperor of the Daleks. Absalom Dark then turns up a month later in the New Adventures in the book Deceit. So again, it all feels as though it's put together. On from that, the next one of sort of the big 3 for me was Final Genesis. 4 parts from August 93. Suddenly Ace is back because she's been introduced back in Deceit in the New Adventures. So she's now back, and it's Turbo Ace from the New Adventures. This one opens with the death of the Brigadier and the Third Doctor.
Oh, okay.
And we then discover this is a parallel universe where the Doctor did make peace with the Silurians in the Silurians, and then rather than go off on adventures, he stayed on Earth for sort of 20 years to make these two races, Homo sapiens and Homo reptilia, work together. And our Doctor from our universe decides to go to this parallel universe to pay respects to the parallel Doctor who's been blown up, but there finds this conspiracy to turn humans and Silurians against each other, and genetic experiments and all of that sort of thing. Now, this is happening in August 93. In October 93, we get the new adventure Bloodheat, which is all about a parallel universe with the Silurians where the Third Doctor got killed. So again, you feel as though it's all going on, but it's just, again, such lovingly done stuff where you can have these genetic hybrids of Silurian sea devils and humans all drawn in a way that, let's face it, 1990s BBC budget would never have been able to do.
No.
And the icing on the cake for this run is a one-off episode of the comic called Time and Time Again. Now, this occurred in DWM 207, which went out in November 93. Of course, the 30th anniversary. So, to celebrate that, we have this one-off comic strip, all in colour again, where the White Guardian turns up and says, "Hey, Doctor, the Black Guardian's changed history, so you've never left Gallifrey, and because of that, Earth's been invaded by everybody, and you weren't there to stop them, and so now you've got to find the key to time and go and put time back again." So the Doctor, Ace and Bernice are each given this MacGuffin to go and each find 2 segments of the key to time scattered through the Doctor's time stream. So we end up with the key to time segments being things like, for example, the TARDIS manual in An Unearthly Child. The Doctor has to steal it from the Hartnell Doctor. They go to the Mind Robber. Another piece is a sword, that Ace has a sword fight with the Third Doctor in the Day of the Daleks and has to get the piece. Bernice Summerfield encounters the Fourth Doctor in Eden and has to get a jelly baby off him, because that's another segment of the key to time. Ace drops in on the Fifth Doctor in Black Orchid, and the segment is the cricket ball, so she has to get that off the Doctor. And
Nice.
the sixth Doctor is actually just this very dark conversation between him and the Seventh about, "I don't like what I'm becoming, and I'm not in a rush to get there," which is really interesting. Then they reassemble the key to time, and it's all sort of wonderful. So some other comics came after that. There were some good ones. Uninvited Guest is really good. At that point, though, they decided that the show wasn't coming back, and so maybe it was time to rest the Seventh Doctor era, and they do a whole bunch of comics with different Doctors. For example, Gareth Roberts writes a comic for the Fifth Doctor and his TARDIS crew called Lunar Strangers, where the Doctor and his team are on the moon with a bunch of talking cow gangsters, because why not?
Exactly.
And so there's lots of things like that. Nick Briggs writes one for the First Doctor, Kate Orman for the Third. But the one I did want to highlight just before I wrap up is one in issue 227 called Up Above the Gods, which is a one-off or a one-episode prequel to Emperor of the Daleks, and it's basically the conversation that the Sixth Doctor and Davros have whilst the Sixth Doctor is taking Davros from Skaro to Spyridon to set up Emperor of the Daleks. And that's just a really nice piece of writing there, and again, some lovely illustrations of the Sixth Doctor by Lee Sullivan. We then get Ground Zero, which is where the comic book sort of says, no, we're going to have our own continuity now, and we're going to write out Ace in our way. And then with September 96, the Eighth Doctor rocks up, and it's a whole new era. So, look, the era that I talked about, very fan-wanky, very holistic Who-niverse, dare I say, but as a 12, 13, 14-year-old boy reading these, I was just thrown into this Doctor Who universe that was consistent, that all worked together. And as I said, the idea that something I read over here fed into something else I read over here was just such a wonderful feeling. And I enjoyed all of those stories, and it was just a lovely time that I think is far too ignored and underrated.
Oh, absolutely. And can I just say, I began earlier in this episode talking about Titan Comics always going back to doing multi-Doctor stories. and how that's quite fan wanky and all of this. And so people out there might be thinking, well, how does that, not differ to the fan wank here? And I think, well, in the Titan stuff, they just do the same concept over and over and over and over. It's multi-doctor, multi-doctor, multi-doctor. Here, at least, there's a ton of stuff that's fan wank, in both your era and mine, but it's all different stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. You can go from something like Final Genesis, which references the Third Doctor and the Brigadier and Lee Shaw and all the rest of it, but it's a very dark, very earnest sort of thing, and they don't actually appear. You then jump into Time and Time Again, which is, hey, it's the 30th anniversary, and we're just going to have a fun comic where we're going to find the key to time by checking in on every Doctor. Let's have some fun.
Yeah, or indeed Planet of the Dead, like I referenced, you do see the old Doctors, but it's just shapeshifters looking like them for a few panels.
Yeah, look, absolutely. But I think that particularly now that the show was off the air, there was a time and a place to really invest in the fans that were sticking with it. Because if you're still reading this stuff by 94, and you're still buying DWM, and you're still buying the New Adventures and potentially the Missing Adventures, you've really invested as a fan. And I think the acknowledgement of that and the reward for that, I think, is actually quite a worthwhile thing. Because, let's face it, in the mid-90s, Doctor Who magazine was not something that a kid would walk into the newsagent and say, hey, that's that Doctor Who show. I like watching that. I'm going to pick it up and see what's in it. That's not going to happen. It's you go to a newsagent and go, can I please get you to get in DWM for me?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. Exactly.
So look, I actually don't have much more to say. I don't have any insightful conclusions. I just had a lot of fun talking about some really fun stories.
Yeah, exactly. So look, if any of these appeal to you folks, try and dig them up. I'm sure fans have made PDFs of them and they're out there on the web somewhere. Or if you've got old issues of Dwim, just pull them out and see what stories you've got. Bit of a lucky dip. Yeah,
there are places you can find old episodes of DWM out there on the internet, or Panini Comics have been putting out a whole bunch of lovely sort of omnibus reprints. So they'll basically pick sort of 5 or 6 stories from a year or two and put them out as lovely editions. Now, they're hard to buy first issues of. Most of them do sell out fairly quickly, but
yeah,
I'm sure there are eBay copies and other various versions out there. So I hope you enjoyed that, and look, let us know if you shared this era of DWM or there are other eras that are your favourite.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.